Does Molinism collapse into determinism? One of the most common objections against Molinism that open theists and simple foreknowledge Arminians lodge against Molinism is that it essentially collapses into a form of determinism. Now, if you're not familiar with Molinism, and a lot of people aren't, allow me to briefly explain the view first. Molinism is the view formulated by Luis de Molina, a 16th century Jesuit priest. He divided God's knowledge into three logical moments: natural knowledge, middle knowledge, and free knowledge. God's natural knowledge is his knowledge of everything that could happen in any given circumstance. It's his knowledge of all the free choices any creature could make in any given circumstance. It's also his knowledge of all necessary truths, such as 1 + 1 = 2. God's middle knowledge is his knowledge of everything that would happen in any given circumstance. It's his knowledge of what any free creature would freely choose in any given circumstance. For example, God knows if Evan Minton were given $2,000 worth of Kindle gift cards, he would freely choose to download all of the books on his Goodreads to-read list. Or if Bob went to Tatsuki's Japanese restaurant, he would freely choose to order sushi. God had these two logical moments of knowledge logically prior to his decision to create any world. Logically prior to his decision to create the universe, God knew everything that could happen in any given circumstance and everything that would happen in any given circumstance. God's free knowledge is his knowledge of everything that actually will happen. Free knowledge is synonymous with foreknowledge. This knowledge is the knowledge of all future events. The content of God's free knowledge is a result of the sovereign choice of God to actualize one of the worlds God knew about in his middle knowledge. On Molinism, everything happens because God decreed it, yet all of our choices are free. Let's take the crucifixion of Jesus as an example. The Bible says, quote, "This man, Jesus, was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." End quote. Acts chapter 2, verse 23. The crucifixion of Jesus was deliberately planned by God. His foreknowledge played a role in the matter, but it was wicked men who put Jesus to the cross. Molinists say that God knew that if Caiaphas was high priest in the 1st century, then he would freely condemn Jesus on grounds of blasphemy, and he would freely take him to Pilate for execution. He knew that if Pilate was prefect in the 1st century, then he would freely comply with the demands of the crowd. And God knew that if Judas was born in the time and place that he actually was, then he would freely choose to become Jesus' disciple for a while and would freely choose to betray Jesus to the Sanhedrin. God knew how all of these people would behave if he placed them in the times and places that he did. God decreed the whole thing, but the libertarian freedom of the actors remained completely intact. Some object to Molinism because they think it logically entails determinism. I can understand this concern as I used to have it myself. Theologian Roger Olson, for example, wrote, quote, "I have argued and continue to maintain, once one believes that God uses his middle knowledge to render certain that every creature does what they do by creating them, and placing them in circumstances where he knows they will freely do something, then determinism is at the door, if not in the living room, and that is inconsistent with Arminianism's basic impulses. It makes God the author of sin and evil, even if only inadvertently." End quote. When I was a non-Molinist, I mistakenly thought there was something specific about the circumstances God places us in which gets us to do what we do, thereby collapsing into a form of compatibilism. This is a serious objection that needs to be dealt with. I think the ones that make this objection assume the same kind of fallacious thinking that people make to foreknowledge in general. Fatalism is the view that whatever God foreknows must come to pass, and it cannot not come to pass. After all, if it didn't come to pass, then God's foreknowledge would be wrong. Since God is infallible and cannot be wrong, the future cannot be any different than what God foreknows. This same reasoning appears to be applied to God's middle knowledge as well. whatever God middle knows I would freely do in a given circumstance, then if God places me in that circumstance, I must do it. If I didn't do it, then God's middle knowledge would be wrong, which is impossible. In syllogistic form, the argument would go like this. 1. Necessarily, if God middle knows X, then X would happen. 2. God middle knows X. 3. Therefore, necessarily, X would happen. The problem with this argument is that it commits a modal fallacy. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. All that follows from 1 and 2 is that X would happen, not that X would necessarily happen. X could have been different, and if it were different, then God's middle knowledge would have been different. For example, suppose God middle knew if Evan Minton had the means to attend the 2018 Evangelical Theological Society Conference, he would freely choose to go. And if Evan Minton went to the 2018 Evangelical Society Conference, he would freely choose to attend Kirk McGregor's lecture instead of another lecture. And God actualized a world in which I had the means to go and to the ETS conference in Colorado, and therefore I choose to go there, and I choose to attend Kirk McGregor's Kirk McGregor's lecture instead of one of the others occurring at that time. I submit to you that I could have chosen otherwise. I think I could have chosen other than to attend Kirk McGregor's lecture. I could have chosen to go to a different lecture. I could have chosen to go to a different lecture. I could have chosen to have listened to McGregor's lecture on CD afterwards. I could have chosen not to have attended ETS at all. I could have chosen differently. I could have. But God knew that I would not have chosen differently. I could have chosen differently, but God knew that I would not have chosen differently. Moreover, if I had chosen differently, then God's foreknowledge and middle knowledge would have always contained different content. If I chose differently in the above situations, God's middle knowledge would have never contained the proposition, if Evan Minton attended the ETS conference, he would freely choose to attend Kirk McGregor's lecture. It would have always contained, if Evan Minton attended the ETS conference, he would freely choose to attend a different lecture instead. If I choose to attend Kirk McGregor's talk, God middle knows Evan Minton would freely choose to attend McGregor's talk. But if I chose to attend someone else's talk instead, God would middle know Evan Minton will attend someone else's talk. You see, just because God knows what people would do in any given circumstance doesn't mean people aren't free. My knowing that if I sprayed a random stranger with a super soaker, he would get mad at me, doesn't mean that I causally determine him or fate him to get mad at me. Likewise, God knowing the future doesn't mean that the future is fated to occur. If the future is different, God's foreknowledge is different. While God's middle knowledge is chronologically prior to our choices are logically prior to God's middle knowledge. Let me say that again. While God's middle knowledge is chronologically prior to our choices are logically prior to God's middle knowledge. God's knowledge of free choices are contingent facts which could have been different. And if they were different, then God's knowledge would be different. Think of it this way. Let's say you purchase a car for your son on his 16th birthday. You know how he would react depending on which car you get him. If you buy him a sports car, you know that he would act ecstatic. He would just be really, really excited and overjoyed. Yay, I have a sports car! If you get him an old broken down jalopy, you know that he would act disappointed. Now let's say you bring about one or the other circumstance, and he behaves exactly as you predicted. Just because you knew how he would act and brought about the circumstance to get him to act that way, does that mean that he couldn't possibly have done otherwise? No. He could have acted in a different way than the way that he actually acted. It's just that you knew ahead of time that he wouldn't act a different way. What we have with God's middle knowledge and him acting on it is a would do, would not do differently situation. It's a would do, would not do differently situation, rather than a could do, could not do differently situation. If God knows that if I were placed in situation X, that I would choose A instead of B, and then he places me in situation X in order to get me to choose A, it's not the case that I could not have chosen B instead of A. God just knew ahead of time that I would not choose B. I still could have chosen B and refrained from choosing A. It's just that God knew I would not. The situation is would do differently versus could do differently. If you keep that in mind, you'll see that Molinism doesn't collapse into either determinism or fatalism. God knew that I would not do differently than record and edit this video in the situation that I'm in now, but I certainly could do differently. If you liked the video, please hit the subscribe button and don't forget to turn on notifications. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications. It looks like a little bell icon. And if you turn on notifications, you'll be notified whenever I have new video coming out. And if you feel so led, consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/cerebralfaith. Thank you. Peace out. God bless. And until next time, keep using the brains that God gave you.